afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday. Welcome to our second event in the Fall 2017 Colloquium series. Thanks for being here. It's nice to see a full room. Our speaker today, Dr. Jerry Shannon, certainly needs no introduction. We know him. He's one of our own, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. Jerry, as we know, obviously is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography, but he's also an assistant professor in the department, I had to write this down, the Department of Financial Planning, Housing, and Consumer Economics here at UGA. So he's also part of his appointments over there. Jerry directs the Community Mapping Lab, which is what he'll be talking about today, but he's also the assistant director of the Housing and Demographics Research Center on campus. And if I was to say something about Jerry's work and why it's innovative, it really spans a lot of subdisciplines in geography. So he's asking questions about urban geography, GIS, food studies, social equity, and as we'll see today, engaged community-oriented research. Jerry's published in a number of journals, the Annals, Progress, lots of grants, and we really want to see how Jerry's taking the Community Mapping Lab and putting it in this community geography position here at UGA. And I hear he is a mean trumpet player. I can't attest to it myself, but perhaps somebody could share if they've seen Jerry in action on the trumpet. So thank you for being here, Jerry. We look forward to hearing about the Community Mapping Lab and how you're taking community geographer here at UGA.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Great to have so many of y'all here. We even have an assistant dean with us today, so that's associate with us today, so that's great. We introduced this as something that I'm doing. There's several people in the room that I'll probably call out at some point who have been involved in helping make this run. And so, I think this is a collective effort. It's still nascent. This is the second year, really, of the Community Mapping Lab getting off the ground. I think year one was really us getting our bearings and figuring out kind of what direction do we want to go in, and that's not like that process is completed, but hopefully we're kind of moving now in a direction that I think will be really exciting and productive. So the goal of the talk today really is just to kind of give you an overview of how I would situate this thing called the Community Mapping Lab, how I understand it fitting into kind of a long history of work around community engagement, maps and society and power within geography and the discipline of geography somewhat. And then I'll just talk a little bit more specifically about some values that to me kind of guide what this Community Mapping Lab is about, and give a couple of examples of current engagements that we've got. And then we'll wrap up, hopefully in time to have plenty of time for little games at the very end. So without further ado, let me talk a little bit about big data. So most of you have heard about big data before. This is a big buzzword right now in terms of geography and in terms of the broader academy, right? This idea that we kind of live in an age in which we've become so awash in numbers and quantitative information of photos, of text, of emojis, right? That it's just everywhere, right? And that we can just dig into this data, we can understand it, we'll get a better handle on how things are kind of operating in society, one that's far afield from the kind of old, uninformed, opinionated research that we had. When we talk about big data, we often talk about V's. So things like volume, right? The amount of data that you're getting, the standard definition of big data is that it doesn't fit on a single spreadsheet. We're talking about like real-time Amazon purchases, right? Or emails sent through Gmail. Things that would be impossible to track for any real human being. Things like, so you have volume, variety, so you can have data that fits in a lot of different formats, right? So you can have text, you can have emails, you can have YouTube videos, you can have reviews on TripAdvisor, you can have people's input on where the police are on Waze, right? All these different kinds of data that are coming in. The conventional term for this is VGI, Volunteer Geographic Information, right? And the growth of VGI, the availability of VGI has really been a real buzzword within big data research, that we have all this information that's just being kind of given to us, right, to work with. And in fact, one of the phrases that's been used for this is that data is the new oil. It's this untapped resource, right, that we can mine, that we can understand, that we can use to get at what's really happening in society and how might we need to change governance strategies or policy, how are kind of social dynamics playing out on the ground in various ways. Let's just look at Twitter, right, and we'll figure it out. This has been particularly true for urban governance. So if you think about this effort toward what are called smart cities, smart city initiatives, the idea is we used to live in dumb cities, right? That cities that we didn't really know what we were doing. Maybe we had some broad theories, but generally say we had a Robert Moses, right, who would come in and impose an order on this, or maybe we just kind of let it happen organically, a la Jane Jacobs or whatever. But we have smart cities now, and what that means is we can harvest this big data and use it to understand real-time crime patterns, real-time patterns of congestion within the city. Look at how emissions are changing throughout the day and respond to it somewhat. One poster child for the smart cities movement is this neighborhood of Songdo in South Korea, which is in Seoul, and it was basically a neighborhood that was rebuilt or built from the ground up, right? So it was this kind of blank slate where they built, I don't know exactly how large an area is, I don't remember off the top of my head, but basically built what would be considered in some ways kind of the prototypical garden city. High density or kind of modernist planning example where you have these high density buildings right in the middle, lots of green space, lots of forms of transportation that you can use, so it's not just cars, you can bike, there's boats and all this stuff, and all of it, right, is networked, largely by Cisco, right? It is all connected to one another, and there's data on everything. So you can sit in your living room, right, and control your temperature, but you could also sit in your office. And when you're about to head home, do whatever you're going to do. Turn up the temperature because you're going to be home. Maybe you turned it down during the day. You can teleconference with your friends. It's not just that you be on Skype, but that everybody's all kind of networked together, right? And it's seen as this kind of, hey, look, we can really create the kind of city that works, right, by using all this information that we have and by managing these real-time data streams to really make a city that better serves everybody. Of course, the question is big data really that easy, right? So there's a lot of it there. It seems like it holds some promise. We're not just making educated guesses anymore. We have access to data that we didn't really have previously. There's been a couple of, well, more than a couple, but several critiques that have come up thinking critically about, okay, big data has some promise, right? But what are some possible limitations of it, or what are some kinds of questions that we should be focusing on, that we need to ask? So Rob Kitchen is one of the main people who have been writing about this. Many of you might be familiar with his book Code Space, which is talking about kind of how coding and algorithms are both the world of that production, right, but then how it influences society in some way. This piece came out in GeoJournal a couple years ago now, called The Real-Time City, Big Data and Smart Urbanism. I'm just going to briefly outline 5 different questions he raises related to this. So first is just the politics of big urban data. That is, what do we measure? And why do we measure that and not something else? So for instance, I've done previous work on food deserts and food access. One of the questions could be, why do we care about supermarkets and where supermarkets are? Why is it that we're measuring as a measure of what good food access looks like? Why is it not some other metric, right? And what are the politics that follow from that measurement? So even if we have lots of big data, what is that big data about, and what might be missing? What might we have relatively little data about? That's one of the things you would look at. The processes of technocratic governance, right? So who gets access to the big data, who analyzes it, who makes decisions about what questions to ask from it, and what to conclude. Corporatization of governance and lock-in, he talks about. So once Cisco builds your city, what happens like when you need to update it? Can you switch vendors? Not really, right? You're kind of locked into their one data management stream. Talks about buggy, britable, and hackable cities. So what happens when things start breaking, right? Like driverless cars. What happens when the autopilot goes all hail on you, and decides to veer you off the road? What happens when things start to break down? What happens if somebody's able to hack into the system, that it's not always just this smooth? And then lastly, obviously, questions about surveillance and the panoptic power that this kind of data opens up. Again, who has access to it and what can they use it for? There's 18 cameras in downtown Athens. Who's looking at you, right? And the answer to that question, by the way, is pretty much nobody. They pull that data up later. My understanding is the police officers mainly use that when the parents call to complain about their kids being arrested on the weekend. They can send them the video and say, well, here's what they were doing. You understand why we had to pull them in. But still, right, these are issues. We can also ask questions about VGI specifically. So I won't go into as much detail with this one, but this is a piece that we read in my community GIS class last spring, right, about public participation in GIS via mobile applications. So when we try to get this VGI, how does it work? And one of the lessons I think that came from this is there was a city that tried to do this app for potholes, right? This is one of the things that's opened up by Big data is they're like, well, we can get all this information on where things are broken and be able to get it and fix it. So they created an app, Report a Pothole. Relatively large city, I don't remember which one it was specifically. They got, guess how many reports they got? 77. More than half of those reports were from 2 people. Right? So like, yay, big data, oh wait. In this case, like the data wasn't sitting there, they tried to kind of leverage this. And because there wasn't really a participatory element, like, hey, we're gonna create an app and download the app and use it, like, people didn't buy it, right? And it points to the fact there's this whole kind of social process at play that kind of gets buried when we just focus on, oh, here's the data and it will just tell us what to do, right? And then we have to pay attention to that we have to realize that there's an embeddedness to the ways that data gets used and the implications for policy and things like that. This is not new to geographers. So, Nick has done a ton of work on Detroit Geographic Expedition and Institute, including getting this book republished. But this is an initiative, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, a guy named Bill Bungie back in the mid-60s-ish, right, mid-60s, worked with residents of a particular Detroit neighborhood, Fitzgerald. Particularly, there's a woman named Gwendolyn Warren who ended up kind of co-leading this with him, who's Nick's been working with now, to identify what's going on in this low-income, urban, predominantly African-American neighborhood. And they did some crowdsourcing too. So for instance, they created maps like this one. This is the region of rat-bitten babies, right? This is VGI. Like, where are we reporting rat bites? Let's go and survey people, get data on this, and try to make a map, right, that shows something about our neighborhood that we might not realize already, right? Or this is another one that uses open data. It is available on deaths from auto crashes. The title of this one is Where Commuters Run Over Black Children, right? And the roads downtown. These maps were using publicly available data to make a point, but they were doing so from a particular position, right? To try to achieve a certain kind of political end. And it was very explicit about what that was trying to do. And in the years since Fitzgerald, there's been lots of research kind of thinking critically about, well, how do we situate this use of quantitative information that's not just dismissive of it, right? But tries to think about how do we be reflexive about the way that it's used. So certainly I'd point to what's been called critical GIS or critical cartography. Much of this is largely inspired by reading some Foucault and thinking about what are the relationships between maps, power, and the state. Right? The insistence would be that the modern state really cannot exist without maps. That we have to be able to name and control territory in order for the state to exist. And then we have to think through, well, how, when a map's created, it's not just created to, identify a feature that's there, but it's created for a particular social function, social purpose, and it's created to achieve a certain social end. And so we need to be aware of, well, what is the point of this map? What is it trying to do, and how does it legitimate, say, certain forms of governance in society? We can look at information on what's been called public participatory GIS or participatory GIS, PPGIS for short. This became really popular kind of in the early to mid to late 2000s. University of Minnesota, where I come from, had a lot of work on this, and this was taking this rapid growth of GIS and GIS software and technology and thinking about how can we use this to promote citizen engagement. So prior to Twitter, right, when we didn't have these big data streams just knocking at our door, how can we get people involved in citizen science to go out and work together to identify something they want to identify? Think about like environmental justice, right, exposure to hazardous waste. They can go find the data that they need, use GIS to make a case to government, right? So a real focus on participatory methodologies in this that grows, again, out of that same kind of spirit of thinking about how maps work in society. And then lastly, we can think about, along with critical GIS, there's all sorts of GISs, but feminist GIS, right? And thinking about how feminist theory melds with the use of quantitative information. Go back to professional geographer, Women Who Count, I think was the name of the issue in '95, but thinking about how we can use feminist insight into reflexivity, positionality, right? That we don't have a view from nowhere, in Donna Haraway's phrase, but that we're always speaking from somewhere and for a particular purpose, and being reflexive about that. So Mariana Pavlovskaya's article, Feminism and a Geographic Information Systems from a missing object to a mapping subject, right? And thinking about who gets mapped, what say they have and how they get mapped, all these kinds of questions being really critical as well. And so, you know, when I started thinking about, well, what's the community engaged research look like that, you know, I want to have, you know, help support here. You know, for the Community Mapping Lab, it really grew out of an awareness of this tradition, right? And thinking of these traditions and thinking through the kinds of questions, kinds of issues that are raised by, you know, what's come before. And so the focus of the Community Mapping Lab is really kind of thinking about, okay, there's lots of new technology that's available to us. There's lots of new kinds of data that we can get access to that maybe we couldn't 10 or 15 years ago. But that we think critically about, well, why are we using the data that we're using, right? What are we trying to achieve? Who are we working with? Who's represented in the work that we do? And whose perspectives, right, guide the shape of the research that we're doing? And so how do we kind of pull those things together? So I'm going to talk more about values here in a second, but just to give a nod to some other similar kinds of projects that have been done in geography. This isn't the Lit Review, this is more kind of other similar centers. You know, I'm aware of lots of efforts on this, but this is some that stood out to me. So Chicago State University, I don't know if some of you know Danny Block and his work. He's done a lot of work around food systems and food justice kinds of stuff as well. He is at Chicago State University and runs something called the Frederick Blum Neighborhood Assistance Center that has a long tradition of working really closely with community partners in the south side of Chicago, working on a range of issues, particularly food system related issues. Janelle Robinson, many of you heard back in February or March when she came and visited here from Syracuse, and they certainly have a really vibrant program that in many ways was the inspiration for the position that I currently have within the department that I think has been a really helpful resource to kind of think through what something like this might look like. Floating Sheep at the University of Kentucky is now kind of, I think, dying out a little bit as people disperse. But this was a initiative from several folks there, thinking about how to use maps more out of that critical GIS tradition, kind of how to use maps to provoke, right, and to kind of counter map, think about other ways to present data that makes it unfamiliar or kind of questions assumptions that we have. And then at the University of Minnesota, there's something called CURA, which is a state-funded outreach center that works with you know, variety of groups and nonprofits throughout the state, including using GIS. William Craig, who founded, was one of the real founders of PPGIS as well. And so these were all things that I was keeping in mind. But let me run through a couple of four values, right, that I think kind of guide the lab, and then I'll talk through some examples. The first one is thinking about engaged research partnerships, right? Yeah, come on. Grab a seat. There's more over there. There's also food. But engaged research partnerships, that is, that we're not, I don't envision us ever doing a project where it's solely academic people at the table, right? That we're doing research with outside groups. That's not to say that, you know, we're always seeking the ideal partners, right? These research partnerships can be really messy and complicated, and the groups that we work with have budgetary and time constraints. The politics within the organization might be really complicated as well. But that we seek to, you know, start with an engagement with people who are outside of the academy, working on the kinds of issues that we want to focus on. So we'll talk through some more specific examples in a bit. You know, real briefly, for instance, Athens Regional Medical Center, one of the first things, projects that we worked on was doing some mapping of hotspots for ER admissions with Athens Regional. They were interested in doing some work on that. Georgia Organics, Ian Rosser did a quick map with them this last spring related to mapping organic food production within the state, right? And that was just a kind of a one-off thing. Some of these have been a little bit larger. I'll talk more about a Clark County School District initiative in a second. The Atlanta Community Food Bank, let me just say a little bit about them. We've done a couple projects with this. Matt Hauer and I did a project on food insecurity earlier last year, and then Hilda and I are actually working with a project with them now where they're thinking about how to expand, or not expand, grow, mature the kinds of relationships they have with their clients and produce more stable outcomes for them, right? So they're calling this Stabilizing Lives. They came to us and they're like, well, we want to do this program where we can like give people all the food they want for 6 months, and we hope that it's like a food first model, like housing first, if you know that. And if we do that, right, then maybe that'll help them kind of get over the hump in other areas as well, reduce stress, and allow them to kind of get to a place where things are a little more settled down for them. And we were like, okay, that's good, but we've been kind of advocating for a more participatory process. That is, don't just kind of go to people and say, here's what you need, but rather how can we kind of slow this down and create a conversation with folks. around what are some models that you think might be more effective than what you're offering already, addressing a kind of holistic variety of possible needs that individuals might have. And I think that's been a really productive conversation. Food banks kind of within the kind of food activism spectrum are seen as kind of being kind of more of a Band-Aid solution. But I think one of the things that we're trying to pursue with this partnership is to focus on how can we work with this institution and think through what is possible for you and what kinds of research, what kinds of processes might lead to more sustainable outcomes for you and for the clients that you work with. So thinking about engagement, right? And what's it mean to be in these complicated conversations with different kinds of groups? That's the first value. The second value is use of open source and open data when possible. For those of you who don't know, open source is a particular kind of production of software, which is, again, relatively recent, right? Open source is in contrast to a kind of traditional closed source software model where what you have is you have software that you buy that was created by a company, say Microsoft Word, right? Produced by Microsoft, you download it to your computer and you use it. Boom, done. Microsoft gives you updates. Microsoft Windows occasionally shuts down your computer for like a day. And it's it's too bad, right? It's unfortunate, but they know what they're doing, right? Open source is a different model from that. So oftentimes open source, occasionally it will be kind of a ground up effort, but more often they might take deprecated software. So if I take R, for example, which some of you have had to suffer through R with me, R used to be a privately run software package called S. They were really creative in rebranding it. So it was S, and then they made it into R, and they basically said, we'll take this code from this program that basically the company doesn't want anymore. We'll put it on GitHub, which is a place where you can publicly host code, and then we'll collectively try to improve it, right? Collectively try to update it, so anybody can contribute code to R, right? You can look at the code and say, hey, I'm gonna take this little piece of it, I'm gonna fiddle with it, I'll bring it back, I think this makes the program work better. The rest of the group will look at it and say, I agree, and it gets plugged in, and you're good, right? So there's a variety of open source geographic or geographically related software out there that we've worked with. So QGIS is kind of the open source equivalent to ArcMap, right? Free of charge, does a lot of the stuff that ArcMap does. You might swear at it a little bit more, right? But it still mostly does the job somewhat. We've used Open Data Kit, which is primarily used in crisis mapping, but is used for mobile data collection, right? So you can have a web page or you can install this on Android devices. We've used it with a housing survey I'll talk about a little bit later on. Leaflet is an open source JavaScript language that allows you to do mobile mapping. You can create web pages and just, people can look at it, right? There's no charge to using it. It's not like some other services, not to be named, where you have to pay lots of money to have access to their online mapping tools, right? And so the advantage of this is, one, yes, you do swear at them a little bit more. They're not as elegant. They're not as neat, right, as some of the prepackaged stuff. But if you're not, one, we're preparing students for a future in which they may or may not be working for an institution with a budget for the paid software, right? And so we're not kind of hemming them into, you have to buy ArcMap or you're done. And then two, the code that we create can be used, if we're able to do it open source, can be used by any organization that has a computer to run the software, right? And so there's a greater availability of being able to use that analysis. Open data I'll talk about more a little bit later. It has to do with making sure that the data that we create is publicly available, right? That we reduce the amount of proprietary ownership of the data. 3, explicit focus on community empowerment, right? So keeping in mind this idea that maps and power are intricately tied together. That we think through not just, here's a cool project to work on, but we think through kind of what kinds of maps do we want to make and how does that relate to power relations writ large or small within society. So, in general, we've tried to find projects where what we're doing will promote goals of justice and equity, for instance. So we'll talk more about a project that Danny Ayala has kind of spearheaded and Hancock a little bit later on today around gentrification issues. There's another project that I've worked with several different Georgia communities called the Georgian Initiative for Community Housing. And that's about kind of creating more equitable, affordable housing options in several different, particularly small Georgia communities that were 2,000 and less, right, individuals. And so we're thinking about the analysis that we're doing, how does it help kind of make a society that's fair and more equitable for individuals and empowers the kinds of people who are generally marginalized in these kinds of conversations as well. And then the last one is academic collaboration and interdisciplinarity. That's kind of a long thing to say. Academic collaboration and interdisciplinarity. And that's to say that we want to have a big table, right, that anybody can come sit at, both within our lab. So we're mostly geographers, sorry. We're mostly geographers, but we do have anthropologists that sometimes show up at our meetings. And we do, even within the geographers, right, we have a range of backgrounds in terms of the kinds of work that people are doing. We've had some anthropologists, as I said, some worked with some folks in design. I've got ties, as Dr. Rice mentioned, to the Housing and Demographic Research Center on campus, and that's part of doing this research on housing that we've done. We've worked with the community design folks, Pratt Cassidy, over in the College of Design around the charrettes that they do, and trying to engage partnerships kind of inside the university that way. Also, most of the projects that we've done have involved multiple folks within the university who are from a range of disciplines. So for instance, the Athens WellBeing project that I'm about to talk about was done with Dr. Grace Bagwell as kind of the main initiator of that project, and she's in public administration, or health administration and policy. I can say it, Doris took it. Health administration and policy. So she's over on the other campus across town. But the goal here is, right, that we again have a conversation that's broad, right? That we're not staying holed up in our foxhole, but that we're trying to kind of engage and get out of our comfort zones and really think through kind of what are the kinds of practices that get us into conversations that cause us to question our own position and assumptions when we come into analysis. So let me talk about a few examples here, and then we'll start wrapping up. The first is what's called the Athens WellBeing Project, and this name is about 3 or 4 months old. Has anybody here actually heard of the Athens WellBeing Project besides hearing about it from me? Doris is like, yes, no, okay, you've heard. And I'm sure Danny has feelings on it. So the Athens WellBeing Project grew out of an initiative that started by a guy named Fenwick Broyard, who was at an organization called Community Connections of Northeast Georgia. Community Connections no longer exists, and Fenwick has now left town. But this was his brainchild in some ways. And what he thought was, we've had a long history in town of various groups and organizations doing assessments of where the city's at. That's largely kind of bigger institutional actors. So for instance, the hospitals every 3 years have to do a survey. The police every so often have to do a survey. Housing has to do a survey. Schools do surveys. There's all this stuff going on, and that data kind of gets generated in a very non-systematic way, and then the organization takes it and writes the report they have to report, and that's it, right? And the idea was, well, what if we kind of get all these folks to the table and think about, having, first of all, just coordination about, okay, we're all interested in similar kinds of questions. What if we have just one survey effort to do this? And then one of the things that we've really insisted on in this process is that the results of that survey, right, are broadly available. So the initial push was, okay, we'll do the survey, but we want to make sure we have a handle on the data. And one of the things that both Grace and I have really pushed for is that we need to have an open data, element to what we're doing here. So the goal is whatever data we collect will eventually be available for people to use, and then we'll try to facilitate processes by which people at the local level can interact with that data. One of the main ways that's going to happen, at least in theory at this point, is that there's a transition going on that some of you might be aware of within Athens Park County Schools. Dr. Knox will be able to speak to this much more than I can, because he's a school board member now and is privy to all sorts of secret information. But there's a transition going on from being kind of your regular public school district to being a charter school district. And that at each elementary school, there's going to be these things called local school governance teams that will look at issues that are specific to the neighborhoods in which they're in. This survey, along with some other stuff, will help kind of inform the kinds of issues that they prioritize. They're seeking to kind of look at issues that both affect kids within school, but also outside of school, right? And so the idea is that we can kind of get a broader conversation about what are the needs in the community, right? And think about how do we want to together then focus on the kinds of things that affect folks. You can imagine this going in lots of different directions. Those of you who've thought about community-oriented projects like this, community projects like this, it could become something where, the same people show up to the meetings and they bring up the same problems and not a lot changes. But I think this is a initiative at this point that has some real momentum behind it, and I think it's worth engaging in. So what we're doing, and that there's other pathways that it could go. So what we're doing at this point is we're going to help, we've helped kind of think through what are the kinds of questions that would be good to ask, who do you need to involve in that process as well, and then we're going to, on the back end, work with that data both to do some analysis, but also think about how to make it public. To that end, one of the things that community GIS students last spring in my course, several of whom are in this room, did was we did a kind of secondary data review. So we looked at all the available data. We looked at data that was available from census. We looked at data that was held by folks in the city. I think my favorite was there was data on crowdsourced bird calls as a measure of ecosystem diversity. And so, found several different indicators, right, that would look at the kinds of issues that people want to bring up: housing, community safety, neighborhood quality, things like that. And pulled that together, made a report. This is about 220 pages long. It's super long. It'll be on the website soon, in the next week or two, for you all to download and look at if you want. But then we've also got data that eventually will be available online once we get the code smoothed out to have it this way. Right now it's just living in the Google Doc, but every single indicator that we look at, so for instance, this is the crime tab. We have data on every crime in Athens going back to, I believe, 1990. Literally every police report. So it's, tens of thousands of records. And looking at that, patterns, particularly by elementary school attendance zone. Obviously, even you think about things like crime data, that can, again, go lots of different ways in terms of what do you do with crime data? But I think that's a conversation worth having. Is there relevance? Is there something that you can do with this data that doesn't just say stigmatize poor communities, but actually produces more productive kinds of conversations in addition to that? So it was a great exercise to work through with students. They did a lot of work pulling all this data together, and I'm excited to see where this project goes. So that was example one. Example two is this Georgian Initiative for Community Housing. I'm going to talk about that real quick. So this is an already existing program. They just celebrated their 10th anniversary. I kind of have become involved in it, and Julia Connell, who I don't believe is here. Is Julia here? No. So Julia Connell's done a ton of work on this as well. One of the things we've been able to do last year and this year is hire some undergrads to work as RAs for the lab, and they've taken a lot of initiative with that. Caledonia Orsini, who some of you might have had as a student, also worked last year, and she was great. She worked a lot with Danny on the Hancock project. Anyway, the Georgian Initiative for Community Housing is a 3-year program where communities, largely smaller communities throughout Georgia, get kind of intensive support to redo their plan for affordable housing in their communities. They insist that it's a broad array of people at the table going in, so these teams are often 15 or 20 people coming from a range of backgrounds within the community. They meet twice a year, kind of in a big group, and get all sorts of front-end help in thinking through what are the kinds of issues you might want to think about, what are some strategies that might be more or less effective. My role in this project has been to think about, are there ways that kind of a PPGIS approach coupled with some of this new mobile data collection and analysis tools could help facilitate those conversations. So that's largely meant helping them do kind of housing assessments within their communities. What are the kinds of things they want to look for to identify needs that could enable claims towards a community development block grant applications is one of the most common outcomes here. Basically to help get money to help fix up their town, right? And what are ways that we can help make that happen? I've mentioned ODK before, so this open data kit, we've got surveys they can do on phones, or I've got 10 Kindle tablets that send out to the communities, and right now I think Monroe is in the midst of doing like 3,000 housing surveys where they're at. They've had those tablets for a while. But we work with that data, and I'm going to do a quick show and tell using something called Shiny in R, which Doris loves too much. So R is an open source software package, right? R Studio has developed this tool for R called Shiny that allows you to run visualizations that you can do in R online. So it's a way to do kind of interactive data visualization. This is still kind of an early attempt at it, but let me give you a sense of what it looks like. So this is in Millen, Georgia. Does anybody know where Millen is? Okay, a few of you. It's kind of down towards Savannah a little ways. Not a super huge town. And this is kind of what the survey ends up looking like. So they end up with a survey. These are all the properties that they've surveyed so far. I think they're still planning on doing a little bit more. Oh, let's see if I can actually hit the right button here. Right, but you can go in, there's a base map on here, and each of those dots is a parcel, right? You can click on a parcel and you'll find out the information on it. So for instance, here's the parcel ID, gives some general information. They've got pictures, up to 4 pictures for each property. It'll list if there's any problems. In this case, there's no problems listed, no other issues listed. If we pick one of these, it's a little more red. Right, so here's one where we've got all sorts of issues. We've got roof sway, we've got bare wood porch damage, foundation damage, steps falling in. There's some pictures here. You can see what it looks like. These are pictures that they took in doing the survey. So here's the property, and they can kind of use these all as reference for thinking about where the kinds of patterns that are showing up. We can sort the properties, so we can do, what if we want houses that have some kind of issue only? We can slide these over, and just the dots will show up that fit these descriptions. We can look for where are particular types of problems. So if we want to look for just housing that has foundation damage, right? This will be the ones that show up as red on this map, are the ones that show up. So, the goal here is, these are communities that have no GIS capacity, right? So they literally have no way, they barely have parcel data of any kind to work with beyond just kind of what they have with the tax assessor. For the county, what are ways that we can help them kind of work with this data to help facilitate conversations about what needs to happen in the community, hopefully do lots of community engagement around those conversations once the data is collected, so this isn't just kind of a closed door process. To, again, deal with maybe some pressing issues that really affect quality of life for many of their residents, right, is the goal. And so this has been kind of one of the major initiatives going on in that case. Then the third example I'll give is, this is a project that, and Danny, you can interrupt me whenever you want. This came out of, this was kind of a weird deal. I think you knocked on my door, Danny and I were so this is Danny, I'm going to say hi to Danny. She knocked on my door with some I don't even remember what the question was, right? Last year we were like, we're doing this project. I'm totally putting you on the spot, sorry. I'm working on this project with some folks in the Hancock neighborhood who are concerned about gentrification in their neighborhood. And for those of you who don't know what Hancock is, you might still be new to Athens. We are, let's see here. So this is Broad Street, right here, right? The black line is the Hancock neighborhood. This is Broad. This is basically Baxter Street. So like the Athens Library is here. We're like down here somewhere right now. So this is Millage and Broad, which is better known as the Varsity, kind of right in the middle of it, right? So it's a historically African-American neighborhood. There's actually, if any of you are interested, there's a great 10-minute video online about sit-ins at the Varsity during the 1960s that are worth looking at. But historically African-American neighborhood within the city, but there's some concerns that maybe there's more pressure for gentrification moving in, particularly with folks kind of around the Prince Avenue corridor pushing down the redevelopment of the health sciences campus, which is up here. So we're interested in doing that, but I think the question was, do we have any census data that we could use that would help work with that? And I said, you know what, I've got an undergrad RA, let's do it, let's look and see what we can find out. And so we spent a lot of last year looking at that question. The map that you see up here right now, these are parcels, residential parcels within the city, so there's a lot of non-residential parcels in this area. It's commercial or governmental or parks. But it's changed in assessed value from 2010, I believe, 2005 to 2015. So there was a little bump in the road, price-wise, if some of you remember in the late 2000s, 2008 or so. But basically, if we take what the value was, the assessed value by the city in 2005, compared to the value in 2015, how did the assessed values change? And what we see is, for instance, the values did quite well up in this area, up around the health and medical campus, right? But in this area, which is kind of the core of the Hancock neighborhood between Broad and Baxter, right, very low compared to everywhere else. This is price per square foot, right? So what we're seeing is a real depression of prices here. And then this area is kind of mixed. It's like, it's interesting. This area is largely African American. This area is also somewhat mixed, right? So there's some evidence that, property prices did not rebound as well in the African American areas. We also have this map, which is a GIF, right? So it's going to actually do stuff. This is percent non-white, right? So real basic census data at the block level, right? And it goes 1990, 2000, and 2010. And what I want you to pay attention to is this area right around Millage and Broad. And look what's happening during that time. You can see a real kind of shift that way, right, of the non-white population. And by association, an increase in the white population in that area. There's actually an increase over here as well, but I think there's some more complicated things happening there. That's over where the public housing, all the homes were demolished. And I think there's probably more to the story. But I think there's a real clear sense that, in some ways it's kind of getting pushed this way and concentrated. Remember, these are the areas where home values were, quite low compared to other areas, compared to what was going on here. And so one of the things that I think we point to as like a real positive step out of this partnership was that there's a lawyer who's working pro bono for this organization. HACAD is the term that they're going by at this point. And there's some concern that there's really not much happening in this neighborhood. Like, we don't really need to do any kind of fight with it. And they were going to pull the pro bono lawyer, the agency that he works for, we're going to pull them. My understanding, again, you can correct me on this, is basically you went in with these maps, right? And showed this to them and they said, oh, well then, yeah, gentrification must be happening. Okay, it's fine, he can stay, right? But it was basically like you had this moment of being able to say like, hey, look, here's the data, right? And it had an effect that's really significant for that community in terms of being able to have access to somebody who's conversant with the legal issues at stake, right? And so I feel like that's a partnership that we're not sure exactly where that's going to happen yet. Sounds like right now there's particularly concern about the West Broad Market Garden site and what's going to happen with that. For those of you who don't know, the school district is relocating from way over kind of in the boonies to right downtown, right where there's all those streets that come together right by Broad. So basically right down